cult of tipping. How corporate greed manipulates American generosity.
The culture of tipping in the United States has become so normalized that few stop to question its origins or implications. From restaurants to coffee shops, ride-sharing apps to delivery services, Americans are bombarded with digital prompts to tip sometimes before service even begins. At first glance, tipping seems noble. A way to thank workers for good service and support individuals who depend on those few extra dollars. But beneath that cultural script lies a troubling truth. Tipping, in its modern American context, functions as a tool of corporate deflection. It allows large corporations to offload the moral and financial responsibility of fairly compensating workers onto the very consumers already struggling within the same economic web. Question: have you ever paused before tipping and asked yourself whether it is truly voluntary, or subtly coerced through guilt and social pressure? The historical roots of a deceptive custom. To understand the manipulative power of tipping today, we must trace its roots. Tipping entered American culture after the Civil War, imported from European aristocratic customs. Wealthy Americans returning from Europe admired how nobles rewarded servants with modest coins, a gesture that reinforced class hierarchy. In post-slavery America, particularly in hospitality and rail industries, tipping became a convenient mechanism for employers to keep enslaved black workers in subservient positions without paying fair wages. By 1938, when the Fair Labor Standards Act established a federal minimum wage, tipped workers were excluded from its protections. This legalized exception, rooted in racist and classist structures, has persisted, creating a parallel labor system where millions rely on customer generosity instead of employer accountability. Question: how might the racial and class origins of tipping influence the way we view this practice today? The psychology of guilt and gratitude. Corporations have mastered the art of emotional manipulation, transforming tipping from a token of gratitude into an expectation anchored in guilt. Social norms dictate that failing to tip is rude, even shameful, but few question why they should subsidize a corporation's labor costs. Point-of-sale systems push digital tipping options as defaults. And socially engineered messages: help support our team, or show appreciation for your barista, frame basic labor compensation as an act of kindness. This psychological framing shifts moral responsibility downward, situating the consumer, not the corporation, as the moral arbiter of fairness. Question: when you see a tipping prompt, do you feel it as an act of gratitude or as an obligation imposed on you by invisible forces of social guilt? Corporate strategy: a masterpiece of exploitation disguised as empowerment. Behind every smiling employee holding a tablet with a spinning tip screen is a corporate machine that understands behavioral economics better than most consumers. The existence of tipping allows corporate leaders to justify suppressing the minimum wage. The typical hourly pay for a tipped worker in the U.S. is just over $2 federally, a number unchanged for decades. Employers argue that tips make up the difference and promise to supplement pay if tips fall short, but such measures are rarely enforced. In essence, American corporations have engineered a clever form of wage laundering, offloading the moral duty to pay a living wage onto customers while maintaining control over labor conditions. Question: who truly benefits from a system where customers, not employers, provide most of a worker's income? The illusion of choice. Advocates of tipping often claim it ensures better service by linking pay directly to worker performance. But this argument collapses under scrutiny. Numerous studies reveal that tips correlate less with the quality of service and more with arbitrary factors: gender, race, attractiveness, and even the server's mood or voice tone. The performance incentive myth functions as a convenient cover story masking deeper exploitation. When workers depend on variable income, they must emotionally perform gratitude to survive, often tolerating harassment or mistreatment to preserve tip flow. This emotional labor benefits employers, who extract more compliant and customer-pleasing behavior without paying for it. Question: have you ever tipped more because you felt the worker deserved it? Or because social norms made you fear judgment for not tipping enough? The digital age of tipping: convenience or control? Technology has turbocharged tipping culture. In the era of digital transactions, Automated tipping prompts appear almost everywhere, even in contexts where no personal service occurs. Many payment apps present preset options, 15%, 20%, 25%, that psychologically nudge users toward generosity. The irony? These same corporations often pocket part of the tips under vague processing fees, or use tipping data to justify reducing wages and hours. What once was a personal gesture is now a metric and algorithmic assessment of consumer sentiment exploited to maximize corporate profit while keeping overhead costs minimal. Question: how often do you think your tips actually reach the worker who served you, and how much might corporations be taking off the top? The sociological trap, the moralization of service sociologically. Tipping reinforces a moral hierarchy between the served and the serving. The act of tipping allows middle-class consumers to feel benevolent, momentarily aligning themselves with generosity, even when they too are victims of corporate exploitation in their own workplaces. By turning fairness into a moral transaction, tipping obscures class solidarity. Instead of uniting around shared economic precarity, workers and consumers end up opposing each other in a theater of mutual dependence. The sociologist Pierre Bourdieu might describe this as a moral economy of domination, where virtue masks exploitation and generosity becomes a smokescreen for systemic inequality. Question: does tipping make you feel good because you helped, or because the system convinced you that your help replaces justice? Notice tip variations by server traits. Does it prompt reflection on subtle prejudices in routine exchanges? The corporate playbook, psychological engineering as policy. Corporate capitalism thrives on outsourcing costs, whether through layoffs, automation, or consumer participation in unpaid labor. The tipping system crystallizes this philosophy. Companies craft narratives of community, teamwork, and support while refusing to pay staff adequately. When customers complain about tipping inflation, the conversation conveniently shifts away from executive pay or profit margins. CEOs continue earning hundreds of times more than frontline staff while claiming to value customer choice. The moral confusion benefits only one side: the corporations protected by emotional manipulation and public ignorance. U.S. tipping is a lamentable facade, veiling capitalist excesses that impoverish workers. Indoctrinating tips sustains exploitation, enriching elites as inequality widens the top 1%, capturing disproportionate shares while bottoms struggle. Dismantling requires demanding wages over guilt. Question: if a genuine community were the goal, wouldn't fair wages be a stronger statement of solidarity than forcing workers to depend on strangers' generosity? If tipping breeds vulnerability, why normalize it? Empathizing with workers might reshape your stance on this greed. The economic reality of working poverty. For millions of Americans, especially in hospitality, delivery, and service sectors, tipping is not a bonus, it's survival. The median income for tipped workers remains far below the living wage in nearly every state. Unpredictable tips mean unstable income, making rent, healthcare, and childcare nearly impossible to budget. Moreover, workers often face tip theft, where employers illegally deduct portions of gratuities to offset operating costs. Thus, the supposed generosity of the public props up an underregulated system of corporate parasitism. Capitalism's defenders argue this system encourages hard work and personal initiative, yet data consistently show that tipped workers face higher poverty rates than their non-tipped counterparts. Question: how ethical is an economy that forces millions to depend on random customer moods for survival? The global comparison. Why America is an outlier outside the United States. Many countries regard tipping as unnecessary or even offensive because employers are expected to pay fair wages. In nations such as Norway, Japan, and Australia, service workers earn consistent salaries and benefits, ensuring dignity and predictability. The American tipping system is thus not a cultural inevitability but a deliberate economic choice, a reflection of American neoliberal doctrine that privatizes moral responsibility. This exceptionalism exposes how the U.S. normalizes corporate exploitation under the guise of individual freedom. Question: why do Americans equate low wages and tipping culture with freedom, while much of the world equates wage fairness with dignity? The emotional toll on service workers, the constant dependence on customer moods inflicts heavy emotional strain on workers. Servers must smile through burnout, agreeability becomes survival, and emotional authenticity vanishes. Sociologists call this emotional labor, the suppressed frustration and constant emotional self-management required to keep customers happy enough to tip. Each false smile is, in a sense, unpaid labor. Over time, the psychological toll leads to anxiety, depression, and detachment. Yet corporations frame this endurance as the human touch, commodifying authenticity itself. Workers become products, curated personalities engineered for customer satisfaction rather than human expression. Question: how does it feel to realize that what we call good service might actually be a performance of economic desperation? The moral inversion of capitalism. What makes the modern tipping system especially disturbing is how it inverts moral responsibility. Those with the most power, corporations, investors, and executives, carry the least moral burden, while low-income consumers are chastised if they fail to tip enough. Americans are subtly programmed to see tipping as a character test rather than a systemic problem. Generosity becomes a substitute for justice. This inversion protects corporate elites from scrutiny, allowing them to brand themselves as champions of opportunity while keeping labor costs artificially low. It is not that Americans are ungenerous, it that their generosity has been hijacked by manipulative machines of profit. Question: how might moral outrage be redirected from non-tippers toward the corporations that created this exploitative structure in the first place? The role of media and corporate propaganda media narratives reinforce the tipping illusion. Television shows, movies, and even corporate training videos portray tipping as a symbol of decency and gratitude, rarely addressing the exploitative economics underneath. Social media campaigns, sometimes sponsored by corporations, encourage consumers to support local workers during crises without ever questioning why those workers are unsupported in the first place. This subtle emotional conditioning transforms economic exploitation into cultural virtue. It's no coincidence that during economic downturns, tipping prompts become more aggressive. Corporations rely on public guilt to maintain stability without adjusting their own contributions. Question: when the media urges us to help struggling workers, do we ever ask why those workers are struggling in the first place? The pandemic as proof of systemic hypocrisy. The COVID-19 pandemic threw America's labor inequalities into sharp relief. Service workers were praised as essential, showered with gratitude and temporary bonuses, but not with long-term wage reform. As businesses reopened, tipping prompts escalated even in self-service contexts. The pandemic revealed a basic truth. Corporations could reward labor fairly, but they wouldn't unless public perception demanded it. Once the spotlight faded, so did the sympathy. The system reverted to exploiting consumers' guilt and workers' vulnerability. In other words, America didn't learn, it doubled down. Question: did you notice how quickly corporations returned to underpaying workers after the initial pandemic pay rise ended? The sociological consequences. A culture of economic anxiety. From a sociological standpoint, tipping exacerbates economic anxiety and inequality. Consumers feel pressured to perform generosity they might not afford, while workers internalize dependence on external validation. This mutual discomfort fragments social trust, replacing genuine community with transactional compassion. A society obsessed with individual moral gestures cannot sustain structural justice. In this sense, tipping is more than an economic mechanism, it's a cultural engine that perpetuates alienation, guilt, and resentment. Question: what happens to a society when kindness is commodified and generosity becomes a mandatory performance? Toward a just economic model, ending the culture of tipping doesn't mean abandoning gratitude. It means reclaiming justice from the hands of corporate manipulators. A fair economic system must guarantee livable wages, benefits, and stability for service workers, allowing tips to return to their rightful place as genuine tokens of appreciation rather than survival mechanisms. Policymakers could eliminate the tipped minimum wage, enforce transparency around tip distribution, and hold corporations accountable for wage theft and emotional exploitation. True reform would not only stabilize workers' lives, but also free consumers from coerced morality. Question: would you feel more comfortable tipping if you knew it was truly optional and not a lifeline for survival? The path forward. Reimagining responsibility. A reimagined America would reject the false dichotomy between kindness and justice. Gratitude should never replace structural fairness. Workers deserve wages that allow them to live without begging. Customers deserve transactions free from moral guilt. And corporations deserve scrutiny for manipulating both. The tipping system, once viewed as an emblem of appreciation, now reveals itself as a mirror reflecting America's broader sickness. A culture that privatizes empathy and monetizes survival. The fight against tipping culture is not merely economic. It's a moral battle to reclaim decency from the claws of corporate greed. Question: if we truly value workers, shouldn't we demand that corporations, not customers, bear the cost of dignity? Rise up against the tipping lie. Enough is enough. We live in the wealthiest nation on earth, yet millions of workers are forced to beg for survival through tips, while corporate executives hoard unimaginable profits. They call it good business. Let's call it what it is: exploitation wearing a friendly smile. We have been guilted into carrying the burden of corporate greed. We have been told our kindness is the lifeline that keeps workers afloat when, in truth, it's the corporations that have tied those workers to the bottom. Every automatic tip prompt, every help support our staff message, every ounce of guilt pushed onto us is a calculated move to keep us quiet and complicit. It ends now. We, the people, the consumers, the workers, the heart of this economy will not subsidize billion-dollar greed any longer. We demand an end to this minimum wage. We demand that every worker in America earn a living wage, paid by their employer, not by the desperation or generosity of strangers. We will use our voices, our wallets, and our votes to tear down a system that pretends guilt is gratitude. We will support businesses that pay fair wages. We will call out those that don't. We will push our lawmakers to legislate fairness instead of servitude. And we will tell every corporate boardroom, your profit does not take precedence over human dignity. They have twisted compassion into currency, but we can untwist it together. The working class deserves more than scraps of kindness. They deserve justice. They deserve stability. They deserve a nation that values their labor, not just their smiles. So let this be the moment we draw the line. No more guilt screens. No more excuses. No more silence. This is our stand for every server, every barista, every delivery driver, and every person who's ever had to smile while worrying about making rent. Let our collective voice shake the ivory towers of greed. Let it roar through every restaurant, every app, every boardroom. Pay workers what they're worth, and stop asking the people to cover your greed. We've tipped this unjust system long enough. Now it's time to tip it over.
Please tell me what you think and how you feel about this issue. Analyze it, brainstorm it, debate it, and if you like it, please share it. Thank you for watching. I truly and highly appreciate you, and God bless you.